In the previous section, we explored the essential elements that make a real estate contract enforceable under Arizona law: legal capacity, competent parties, lawful purpose, certain specificity, and mutual assent. Those principles now form the foundation for understanding how real-world transactional scenarios, such as counteroffers and verbal agreements, are analyzed for enforceability. This section applies those elements to practical situations that occur daily in Arizona real estate transactions and examines how they are interpreted under state statutes and case law. In real estate, an offer is a proposal made by one party to another, expressing a willingness to enter into a contract on specific terms. Once the receiving party accepts the offer in writing, mutual assent is established, and a valid contract is formed, provided that all other elements, such as consideration, capacity, and lawful purpose, are also present. However, if the receiving party changes even one term, such as the price, closing date, or contingencies, the response is considered a counteroffer rather than acceptance. A counteroffer legally rejects the original offer and replaces it with new terms for the other party to consider. This distinction is critical because a counteroffer ends the original offer's validity. For example, suppose a buyer offers $450,000 for a property in Gilbert, and the seller responds by changing the price to $460,000 and altering the closing date. Although the seller might view this as a continuation of negotiation, it is legally a counteroffer and therefore a rejection of the original offer. If the buyer does not accept the counteroffer, there is no contract, as mutual assent has not been achieved. To form a binding agreement, both parties must sign the same document, agreeing to identical terms. This principle was reinforced in Hill v. Jones, Arizona APC, 1986, which confirmed that mutual understanding and acceptance of terms are fundamental to an enforceable contract. If the buyer offers and the seller counters, there is no mutual agreement unless the buyer agrees to the seller's counter. If the buyer counters back, there is no agreement unless the seller accepts the buyer's counter. Counteroffers must always be in writing to comply with the statute of frauds, which requires written and signed agreements for the sale of real estate. Under ARS, paragraph 44101, any oral or unsigned offer is unenforceable. This protects both parties by ensuring a clear, documented record of what was agreed upon and by whom. The Arizona Association of Realtors provides standard forms, including the counteroffer form, which must reference the original offer and specify which terms are being modified. Once both parties sign, the counteroffer becomes a legally binding part of the purchase contract. Verbal agreements, by contrast, almost always fail the test of enforceability in Arizona real estate. Even if both parties verbally agree to all terms of a sale, the agreement cannot be enforced in court without a written, signed document containing an adequate property description. For example, if a buyer verbally agrees to purchase a seller's home and pays a deposit check, but the seller later accepts a higher written offer from another buyer, the original verbal agreement is void under the statute of frauds. The first buyer may only recover the deposit, not the property. Courts have consistently rejected attempts to enforce verbal agreements in real estate. In Best Visa Edwards, Arizona App 1981, the court ruled that oral agreements concerning real property transactions were unenforceable, even when partial performance had occurred. The ruling reinforced the necessity of written contracts to ensure fairness and prevent fraudulent claims. This principle ties back to the concept of certain specificity, discussed in the previous section. Without written terms, the courts cannot determine the parties' exact intentions. An interesting scenario occurs when parties exchange text messages or emails expressing agreement on terms. Arizona courts have begun to consider whether such electronic communications may satisfy the statute of frauds under the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, UETA, adopted in ARS, paragraph 44, 71 et seq. If both parties clearly intend to enter into a contract and electronically sign their names, the court may consider it a valid written agreement. However, casual messages or unsigned communications remain insufficient. Brokers should remind clients that digital communications can carry legal consequences and should always ensure that final agreements are properly executed using approved forms. Counteroffers can also lead to disputes when timing becomes an issue. An offer may include an expiration clause, stating that it will lapse if not accepted by a certain time. If the other party attempts to accept after the deadline has passed, the acceptance is ineffective and no contract exists. For instance, if a buyer's offer expires at 5 p.m. on Friday and the seller signs it at 6 p.m., the acceptance is legally void unless the buyer reaffirms it. This rule ensures that time-sensitive negotiations are conducted transparently and that no party is bound by an offer that has expired. In Arizona, real estate transactions, enforceability always hinges on written documentation and clear evidence of mutual consent. Every modification to an offer must be initialed, dated, and acknowledged by both parties. Brokers and salespersons have a fiduciary duty under Commissioner's Rule R428-1101 to ensure that all agreements, counteroffers, and addenda are properly prepared and signed before submission. This obligation protects their clients from disputes and ensures compliance with state law. Discussion. Why is a counteroffer considered a rejection of the original offer? Answer. Because once an offer is changed, it becomes a new proposal, and the original offer can no longer be accepted since mutual assent has been broken. Can a verbal agreement for the sale of real estate ever be enforced in Arizona? Answer. No, except in extremely limited cases of partial performance, because the statute of frauds requires all real estate contracts to be in writing and signed by the parties. Why is the timing of acceptance critical in the enforceability of an offer or counteroffer? Answer. Because once the stated deadline passes, the offer automatically expires, and any acceptance after that time does not form a binding contract. Review summary. Counteroffers and verbal agreements represent two of the most common sources of confusion in real estate transactions. A counteroffer legally rejects the original offer and creates a new one, requiring written acceptance for a valid contract to form. Mutual assent is achieved only when both parties sign and agree to identical terms. Verbal agreements, no matter how sincere, fail the enforceability test because the statute of frauds mandates that contracts for the sale of real property be in writing and signed. Timing, clarity, and written communication are essential, as expired offers or unsigned modifications create no legal obligations. Arizona case law, including Hill v. Jones and Bess v. Edwards, reinforces that real estate professionals must ensure that all agreements are documented and executed according to statutory and ethical standards to protect both their clients and themselves. Supporting sources and key case law. Arizona Revised Statutes, Paragraph 44, 101 Statute of Frauds. Arizona Revised Statutes, Paragraph 44, 7001 through 44, 7007. UETA, Commissioner's Rule, R428-1101. Hill v. Jones, Arizona Aptar 1986. Reinforced mutual assent and material understanding in contract formation. Best v. Edwards, Ariz Apsars 1981. Held that verbal real estate agreements are unenforceable under the statute of frauds.